The winter of 1863 swallowed the remote Murphy estate in northern Manhattan with a kind of punishing stillness, the kind that wraps itself around the bones and makes you forget that anything warm ever existed. Snow drifted up against the walls of the old family house, nearly burying the wooden staircase that led to the front porch. From the outside, it looked serene, peaceful even. But inside the Murphy residence, that silence was thick with dread. The estate sat on a forgotten edge of the city, nestled between dead trees and stone ruins that predated the Revolution. No roads led there now, not really. A path could be found, but only if someone told you where to look, and no one ever did. Not any more. Inside the main study, Richard Murphy stood by a window frosted with condensation. He didn't shiver, even though the cold seeped through the floorboards. At 47, Richard had withered into something skeletal, a shape more than a man, hollowed out by decades of self-denial and control. His dark hair was streaked with gray, not in gentle strands, but in clumps that matched the harshness of his beliefs. His eyes, gray and unyielding, gazed out into the frozen woods as if he were waiting for something to emerge. Something divine. He turned toward his son, Thomas, who stood by the door holding a leather-bound notebook. The boy's hands trembled, but he dared not drop the book. It contained his father's revelations, his so-called divine instructions, and no one dared risk a page being damaged. At 23, Thomas had inherited his father's height, but none of his authority. His spine slouched permanently under the weight of fear. He no longer questioned why the ceiling creaked at night, or why the cries from the cellar were ignored. He just wrote it all down, because his father told him to. "The angel spoke again last night," Richard said, his voice low and thick, like honey gone rancid. Thomas didn't respond at first. Then he nodded, the leather book pressed tight to his chest. What did it say?" Richard turned slowly, deliberately, his thin lips curling into something that might have been a smile if it hadn't come from him. "It said the time has come. The final sacrament is ready. We are to become pure." Thomas stared at him, but his face showed no reaction. He had trained himself not to flinch. The Murphy estate wasn't a home. It was a compound, carefully arranged, like a fortified nest. 3 main structures stood in a triangular formation. The large house was where Richard lived with his 3 wives and 8 children. Another smaller dwelling housed 5 adult followers, those who had abandoned the world to live under Richard's rule. And the third building, the one they called the chapel, had no windows at all. No one without permission entered the chapel, and those who did came back changed. Or they didn't come back at all. Mornings began early. The children were awakened before dawn by the sound of a brass bell. Breakfast followed prayer, always porridge, stale bread, and milk taken from the family's lone cow. The men were tasked with chopping wood and keeping the old coal furnace running, while the women cleaned in silence, careful never to speak unless spoken to. Agnes, the first wife, emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray with breakfast for the children. She moved stiffly, her steps calculated and quiet. At 38, she looked twice her age. Her face, once bright with laughter, had faded into a mask of submission. Her once golden hair was now muted gray, pulled back in a severe bun. The heavy brown dress she wore had no shape and no beauty, was designed to erase her body. Agnes had been the daughter of a respected preacher, a woman educated in Scripture and once loved by everyone in their small Irish parish. But that was before Richard convinced her father that Agnes had a sacred calling to be the first mother of a holy family. That calling had led her here, to this crumbling house at the edge of the city, where she served not God, but a man convinced he spoke for him. Behind her came Esther and Lydia, the second and third wives, both younger, both quieter. Esther had joined the Murphy family 5 years ago, after losing her husband to a fire at the docks. With no family left, she found solace in Richard's promises. At first, she believed she'd found a sanctuary. But now, at 32, she rarely spoke, moving through her days with the fearful precision of someone who understood that even minor mistakes had consequences. Lydia, only 25, had been born into the compound. She'd never known another life. Her marriage to Richard had been arranged when she was just 17, presented as a divine honor, the highest role a girl could hope for in a holy family. But it was a prison, and she had no way to escape it. The Murphy children ranged from 17 to 6, and they were as different from one another as stars in the night sky. Thomas, the eldest, remembered a time before the compound, before Richard's visions had grown darker. That memory tormented him daily. Knowing that something normal had once existed made the present all the more unbearable. Margaret, the middle daughter at 17, was silent but sharp. Her dark eyes missed nothing. She obeyed outwardly, but inside she plotted. She had been keeping her own journal, one written in code and hidden beneath the loose boards of her bed. Unlike Thomas, she didn't believe God spoke through Richard. She believed something else had taken over. Something hungry. Eleanor, the younger daughter, at 15, was not so lucky. She no longer spoke. She hadn't since last summer. The day she came out of the chapel, with bruises down her legs and dried blood under her fingernails. Richard had called it purification. The wives had called it sacred. But the look in Eleanor's eyes made it clear. Something inside her had died that day. The younger children, Samuel, Peter, and Ruth, still moved like children. But Margaret feared it wouldn't last. Richard had been speaking of them more lately, mentioning them during his nightly revelations. She knew what that meant. That morning, as they all sat around the long wooden table, Richard stood at the head, his hand raised in silent prayer. Then, as they finished eating in that painful quiet, he spoke the words that would shift the house into a new horror. Tonight, we begin the ritual of sacred unification. The angel says we are ready. A chill swept the room, not from the cold wind outside, but from the silence that followed. Every face at that table paled. Everyone knew what that phrase meant. It was what Richard had said the night Eleanor stopped speaking. It was the same thing he'd whispered to Esther when her hands began to shake for no reason. But now, he said it in front of everyone. This wasn't a private ritual anymore. This was something new. Something worse. Margaret lowered her eyes, her pulse hammering in her throat. In her lap, her hands clutched the edge of her skirt until her knuckles went white. Whatever purity Richard believed in, it wasn't of God. And tonight, they would all be pulled deeper into it. Evening came early in winter, swallowing the Murphy compound in darkness by late afternoon. Shadows stretched long and strange across the frozen ground, while the air outside thickened with cold and something less tangible, something heavy, like a warning no one dared voice. Inside the chapel, preparations were already underway for what Richard Murphy had declared the sacred unification. The chapel was the most feared place on the estate. It was built without windows, its walls lined with thick stone designed to muffle cries, not heat. The only door could be locked from the inside with a rusted iron bar. Richard had drawn its plans by hand, claiming that an angel had described every measurement. The place reeked of damp wood, candle wax, and something more disturbing, something metallic and old, like blood long dried. Margaret had been assigned to help clean the altar. She'd scrubbed it before, after ceremonies no one ever discussed. But tonight she could barely keep her breath steady as she approached it again. The white cloth that covered the platform had stains that never washed out. She didn't want to know what they came from anymore. She already knew too much. Lydia, the youngest wife, joined her, arms full of folded linens and ceremonial robes. Her face was pale, and her lips moved silently, maybe a prayer, maybe a plea to no one. Lydia had always been the quietest. She'd never raised her voice in the compound, but lately she'd begun to shake. Subtle tremors in her hands, barely noticeable unless you look too long. "I can't do this anymore," Lydia whispered as she set the cloth down. Her voice barely rose above a breath. "Margaret, something's wrong. It's getting worse." Margaret kept wiping the edge of the platform, glancing at the closed door. "We can't talk here." "I know," Lydia said, eyes wide. "But he's looking at the children differently now. Not just Thomas or Eleanor. The little ones." Margaret's throat tightened. She had noticed it too. The way Richard's eyes lingered on Peter and Ruth. The way his sermons had started referencing innocence unspoiled and spiritual breeding. Words she didn't yet understand completely, but feared she soon would. "Do you think we could leave?" Lydia asked suddenly. Margaret looked at her. Really looked. "No," she said softly. "He'd never let us. You know what happened to Sister Evelyn." Lydia swallowed hard. Evelyn had tried to leave 3 years ago. Just packed a bag one morning and started walking toward the river. Richard had sent 2 men after her. No one ever saw her again. Richard claimed she had fallen through the ice, a sign of divine judgment. But Margaret had heard murmurs about something being buried beneath the old barn. "Think he's going to involve Mary next," Lydia said. Mary was only 13. The thought made Margaret's hands go still. Her blood turned to ice, and for a moment she couldn't move. "We'll protect her," Margaret said, her voice low and steady, "even if it kills us." That night, the entire Murphy family gathered in the main house's prayer room. They sat in a circle, children and adults alike, with Richard in the center, his Bible open but unread. He didn't need to read anymore. The verses he quoted came from his own mind, twisted interpretations disguised as prophecy. "The angel has shown me a path," Richard said, voice calm, eyes blazing. "A path through the flesh to the spirit. Earthly bonds must be broken, and divine ones created in their place. The sacred unification will make us one pure in the eyes of God." His followers nodded slowly, their expressions dead. They were past the point of resistance. Fear had long since replaced doubt. Even Thomas didn't protest, though his eyes flickered toward Margaret now and then, as if searching for strength. Agnes, the first wife, sat still beside Richard, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her face betrayed nothing. But Margaret noticed the way her fingers gripped one another so tightly the knuckles had gone white. "Tonight," Richard continued, "the children will take their first step toward sanctification." Gasps were stifled into silence. Margaret saw Mary freeze, her mouth slightly open, her shoulders locked. Peter blinked rapidly, not understanding but sensing something terrible was about to happen. Ruth just stared at her mother, confused. "Margaret," Richard said, turning his eyes on her God. She sat up straighter. "You and Lydia will prepare the chapel. Place the oils on the altar. Light the incense. The divine presence will visit us." She nodded. "Yes, Father." But her mind was already running, already planning. She would find the journal. She would write it all down, every word, every movement. If no one stopped him tonight, someone would someday. The truth had to survive. Even if she didn single quotes t later, as she lit the candles inside the chapel, and the shadows began to dance across the walls, Margaret felt like she was standing in a tomb. Lydia moved beside her in silence, setting out the bottles of anointing oil and the silver bowl used in every ceremony. "I'm scared," Lydia whispered. Margaret didn't respond right away. She struck the final match and stepped back to observe the scene, the raised altar, the red curtains, the lines drawn into the floorboards like a map only Richard could read. "I am too," she said at last. "But we have to watch." We have. To remember, no one else will. From outside, the sound of the brass bell rang twice. A signal. He was coming. They took their places at the altar, standing like statues, while the rest of the family filed in. The children walked slowly, some clinging to each other. Richard entered last, his arms outstretched as though welcoming a congregation. Thomas carried the book of visions behind him. Mary was last, her face drained of color, her eyes fixed on the floor. She wore a white robe, one of the ceremonial garments Lydia had sewn herself, back when she still believed in what they were doing. Back when she thought this was holy. Margaret clenched her fists behind her back. The ceremony began with prayer, then chanting, then silence. Deep, suffocating silence. Then Richard began speaking again words about divine obedience and the erasure of earthly shame. He dipped his hands in the oil, raised them to the ceiling, then looked at Mary. She trembled. "The Lord has chosen you," he said. Margaret stepped forward. "No." Her voice echoed through the stone room, louder than she expected. Everyone turned. "No more," she said. "This isn't God. This is you. You're not a prophet. You're a monster." The silence was electric. Richard's face froze. For the first time, he looked unsure. Lydia reached out and took Mary's hand. "You won't touch her." Richard's jaw tensed. "Blasphemy." "No," Margaret said. "Truth." And in that moment, something changed. Something small, but irreversible. Even Thomas stepped back from the altar. The snowstorm returned the next morning, like a warning from above, blanketing the Murphy compound in cold silence. Flakes piled up along the edges of the chapel, covering the muddy footprints left behind by trembling children and wide-eyed women. The wind whistled through cracks in the wooden shutters, but no one dared to complain about the cold. They never did. Complaining meant attention, and attention meant danger. Inside the main house, everything moved in a strange, suspended rhythm. Richard hadn't spoken since the night before, not a word. He had left the chapel in complete silence, his expression unreadable, and hadn't called a meeting or sermon since. It had been nearly 12 hours, and that was unusual. When Richard went quiet, it didn't mean peace, it meant calculation. Margaret knew the silence wasn't safety. It was the deep breath before something worse. In the kitchen, Agnes moved. Robotically, boiling water for porridge with hands that shook only slightly now. Years of control had trained her not to reveal her thoughts. But Margaret noticed the twitch in her jaw, the glances toward the door. Mary hadn't spoken all morning. Not to Margaret, not to her mother, not even to Ruth, who'd tugged at her sleeve with sleepy eyes, asking if everything was all right. Mary only nodded once, then stared out the frosted window as if trying to see past the trees, past the snow, into another world that might let her disappear. Margaret pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders. She'd never been more aware of how fragile time felt inside the compound. The hours stretched like cold taffy, thin and trembling. Richard might burst through the door at any moment with some new revelation, or he might wait until nightfall to strike with ritual and punishment. Either way, the decision Margaret had made last night was irreversible now. She had spoken. Up. She had said no, and there was no going back. In the far end of the house, Thomas sat at the small wooden desk near the chimney, his back hunched, his hand moving slowly across the page of his father's journal. Even now, even after what had happened, he still wrote. The obedience had become instinctual, like breathing. But something in his writing had changed. He wasn't just transcribing anymore. He was recording. A thin candle flickered beside him, casting shadows over the lines of ink. His handwriting, once neat and loyal, was beginning to curve differently, more human, less rehearsed. He wrote what Richard had said the night before, but this time he also added what Margaret had said. No more. 3 words. but powerful. Enough to shake the floorboards beneath them. Thomas knew he was supposed to report her defiance. Richard had always insisted that purity began with vigilance. The family was to observe one another, correct one another, expose weakness. But Thomas didn't pick up the second journal, the red one where violations were logged. Instead, he kept writing in the brown leather book, the one that belonged to Richard, but had now become something else. Evidence. He dipped the pen again, but his hand paused before returning to the page. What if Margaret was right? What if it wasn't God speaking through Richard? What if it never had been? In the smaller house, where the most loyal followers lived, whispers were stirring. George Willis, a balding man in his 50s with frost-bitten fingers and a face like crushed stone, sat on the edge of his cot. His wife Maureen moved about the room, folding blankets that no longer needed folding. They hadn't been allowed. Inside the chapel last night, Richard had said the ritual was for blood kin only, a phrase he had started using recently. George hadn't questioned it, not out loud. But something in the way Richard had looked at the children, the way his voice had dropped into that low, breathy cadence, had made George feel sick for the first time in years. Maureen finally spoke. She defied him. George nodded slowly. She did, and he didn't stop her. He will. But what if he doesn't? That silence between them said more than anything else could. George had joined Richard 10 years ago, when he'd lost his farm and his third child to diphtheria. Richard had promised healing, purpose, redemption, and for a while it felt true. The rituals were odd, yes, but there had been unity, certainty. The world outside was madness, but inside these walls there were rules. Richard had given them structure, but now it felt different. It felt dark, unclean. What would you do if he asked you to? Maureen didn't finish the sentence. George stared at the floor. I don't know anymore. Later that day, Margaret sat in the attic, back pressed against the cold wall, clutching the small journal she'd been keeping for nearly 3 months. It was thin, almost flimsy, bound in cracked black leather. Its pages were filled with symbols her own cipher, so that no one else could read it if they found it. Not even Thomas. She'd learned early on that writing the truth was dangerous. She'd seen Agnes beaten once for mentioning a dream that didn't align with Richard's visions. Words had to be buried, hidden, but they still had to be written. She flipped to the most recent page and began scribbling quickly. Last night, he named Mary. She wore the white robe. I saw the bruises on Lydia's wrists. No one said anything. Not one word. I spoke. I stood between him and her. He said nothing, but I saw it in his eyes. He'll make me pay. But I'll keep writing. If I don't survive, someone must know the truth. She paused, listening. The wind howled against the attic window. Somewhere below, the sound of a pot clanging in the kitchen echoed faintly. She wrote again. I believe Richard Murphy is planning something final, something irreversible. He's spoken of bloodlines lately, of angels demanding purification. Through flesh. I don't understand it all, but I know it's evil. He uses God's name like a sword, and we are his victims. She tucked the journal into the seam between the attic floorboards. No one else came up here anymore. The stairs were steep and narrow. It felt like the one place she could still breathe. That night, Richard finally reappeared. He stood at the center of the dining room with Agnes beside him and the red journal in his hand. The Book of Sins. Everyone froze. Someone, he said, has spoken blasphemy in the chapel. The children didn't move. The wives stood in place, like dolls carved from fear. Margaret watched him, her heart pounding so loudly she thought others might hear it. He opened the journal, though no new entries had been made. I was told by the angel that purity must be restored, that doubt must be cut out like a tumor. His eyes scanned the room, then landed on Margaret. She met his gaze. A pause, then a smile. "I forgive," he said, and that scared Margaret more than anything else, because Richard Murphy never forgave, not unless he was planning something worse. The storm had eased by morning, but the air felt heavier, as if the snow itself had soaked up everything dark and unspoken inside the house. No one mentioned Richard's forgiveness from the night before. No one dared. Forgiveness, when it came from him, wasn't a blessing, it was a warning. The kind that lurked beneath the skin like an infection you couldn't see until it was too late. Margaret hadn't slept. She lay wide-eyed in her cot until the sky shifted from black to gray, then dressed in silence while the house remained still. Her legs felt stiff from hours of tension, and her stomach ached from hunger, but she didn't go downstairs for breakfast. She went to the cellar. It wasn't allowed. But Richard had left early to inspect the perimeter with George Willis and the others. That gave her a brief window of time. She clutched a candle and a stolen key one she had taken from the kitchen weeks ago when Lydia wasn't looking. And now, after what Richard had said the night before, after the way he smiled at her, she needed to know. The cellar door groaned as she opened it, dust falling from the hinges like dead snow. The stairs were steep and slick with cold. Margaret held the candle low and stepped carefully. Her breath caught in her throat as the air thickened. The smell of damp rot hit her immediately, dirt and mold. Yes, but also something else. Something metallic. The same scent that clung to the chapel's altar. The same scent that never left Mary's skin after rituals. At the bottom of the stairs, the passage opened into a wide, low room. Stone walls surrounded her, slick with moisture. Wooden beams overhead dripped condensation like slow tears. In one corner sat a small wooden bench, stained and broken. Beside it a crate filled with long strips of cloth and copper wire. And across from that, bolted into the far wall, were iron bars. A cell. Margaret's stomach turned. The gate was unlocked. She stepped closer, the candlelight flickering across the walls, revealing scratch marks on the inside of the stone. Scratches that looked like fingernails had made them. Dozens of them. She bent down and traced one with her fingertip. And then she heard something behind her, the soft scuff of feet on stone. She spun around, heart lurching, but it was Thomas. He stood halfway down the stairs, face pale, breath sharp. From the cold, "I saw you leave the kitchen," he said. "Where did you get the key?" "I took it," she whispered. He didn't move, just stared at the cell, then at her. "You know what this is for, don't you?" Margaret didn't answer. Thomas stepped into the room and took the candle from her hand, lifting it toward the ceiling. A flame illuminated old beams, covered in faded, painted words. They looked almost like scripture verses written by hand. In dark ink. Except it wasn't ink. "I think it started before I was born," Thomas murmured. "Before any of us knew what he really was." Margaret looked at him, startled. It was the first time he'd ever spoken openly against Richard. "I found one of your journals," he said softly. "In the attic. I read it." She froze. "Put it back exactly where it was," he added quickly. I had to know." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Thomas stepped toward the cell and placed the candle on the floor beside it. "You wrote that he's planning something final." Margaret nodded. "He's calling it the cleansing of the bloodline. I think he's going to take Mary. Maybe Ruth. He talks about angels, but he means children." Thomas's shoulders slumped as if a great weight had finally been admitted. "We have to do something," she whispered. Thomas turned and met her eyes. "We already are." That evening, Richard called a family meeting in the chapel. He hadn't done that since the earliest days, when the compound still felt like something new and hopeful. when his visions were strange, but not terrifying. When the followers still believed he had been chosen for something greater. Now, the announcement sent a ripple of unease through the compound. Agnes moved more slowly than usual, her hand trembling as she tried to pull her coat from the hook. Lydia stood in the corner, staring at nothing, her eyes glassy and far away. Even Peter only 9 looked confused and afraid. Everyone gathered. In silence, Richard stood in front of the altar, arms wide, flanked by the red journal and the brass chalice. The oil burners were lit, the room filled with the smell of incense, rich, cloying, almost suffocating. The shadows moved across the walls, like ghosts trying to escape. "The angel," Richard began, "has spoken again." He paused, letting his voice ring. "And the time has come to complete our sanctification. The children will lead us, as it should be, as it was always meant to be." Margaret felt Mary flinch beside her. Agnes lowered her head. "We will begin tomorrow night." Richard continued. "In this place, at the hour of divine passage." Thomas stepped forward, slowly. "Father," he said, carefully. Richard turned to him. Thomas took a breath. "Will there be preparation needed?" Richard nodded, pleased. "Yes, you and George will prepare the outer rooms, cleanse them. They must be pure for what's to come. And the women? They'll remain here," Richard said, "in prayer." Margaret kept her face still, but inside she was screaming. That night, back in the attic, Margaret and Thomas met in silence. The others were asleep or pretending to be. Agnes had curled into a corner with Ruth in her arms, and Lydia sat rocking near the stove, humming something tunnels. Thomas pulled out a second journal. Not his father's, not Margaret's. A new one. Blank pages. He held it out to her. "We write everything together," he said. She took it. "And when the storm comes," he added, "we run." Margaret opened the cover, ran her hand over the page, and nodded. "No more rituals," she whispered. "No more silence." He looked out the attic window, toward the woods beyond the compound. "Tomorrow night," he said. "If we don't stop it, then we never will." Margaret stared at the dark trees and imagined a road that led out somewhere cold, yes, but free. The sun never really rose the next morning, just a dim grayness that settled over the Murphy estate like a burial shroud. The light filtering through the frost-covered windows looked more like ash than daylight. And as the final day before the ritual began, everything moved slower, like time was hesitating to bring what was coming. Margaret stood at the edge of the woods just after dawn, pretending to collect firewood. The air bit into her fingers and nose, but she needed space. Breathing had become harder inside the house. Every room echoed with the weight of what Richard had declared. She couldn't look at Mary without seeing that white robe. Couldn't look at Ruth without wondering how long until her name was next. She dug her heel into the snow, staring out into the trees. Somewhere beyond them was a world untouched by this madness. A world where girls went to school, not to altars. Where mothers weren't required to stay silent while their daughters were offered up for sanctification. But that world had no map, no road from here to there. "Did you find the pages?" came Thomas's voice behind her. She turned. He wore a heavy coat and carried a satchel. His eyes looked sharper now, more alert. Whatever flicker Margaret had lit in him was growing. She nodded. Under the floor in the chapel, pages from before the compound was built, before Father changed everything. They walked deeper into the woods, far enough that the trees could muffle their voices. "Some of it's in Latin," she said. "Some's in English, but all of it talks about blood, about purity, about children born in spiritual union." Thomas's face darkened. "That's what he means by cleansing the bloodline." He thinks he's chosen to seed a new kind of family. He doesn't think it, Margaret said. He believes it, with everything he has. She pulled a page from her coat pocket worn, riddle, torn from Richard's original journals. Across the top in red ink were the words, "The final vessel will bear his light." "That's Mary," she whispered. "He's planning to take her completely. Not just a ritual, a union, a child." Thomas looked physically ill. "No," he said. "Not if we stop him." Back at the house, Agnes was sewing. She sat near the fire, needle moving rhythmically through white linen. She didn't speak, didn't look up, just stitched and pulled, stitched and pulled. The robe on her lap looked identical to the other's long sleeves. High neck, soft folds, but Margaret could tell this one was different, smaller. For Ruth. She crouched beside her. "Is that for her?" she asked gently. Agnes paused, then nodded. "She's only 7, Margaret said. "I know," Agnes replied, voice barely audible. "Then why?" Anne's eyes flicked up, and for the first time in weeks, there was a crack in her expression. "Because if I don't make it, he'll make Lydia do it. And Lydia's already dying inside." Margaret swallowed hard. "I thought I could protect them by staying obedient," Agnes said, "by staying useful. But I was wrong. He doesn't care. He never did." She handed the robe to Margaret. "Burn it." Thomas spent the rest of the day in the outer building with George, sweeping the narrow halls and clearing the upper rooms as ordered. Richard had said these would be the cleansing chambers, spaces, where the body would be purified before the final sacrament. Thomas could hardly breathe inside them. The windows had been boarded up from the outside. The only light came from a single lantern, swinging slowly from the ceiling. The walls were damp. The air smelled of vinegar and iron. Chains hung from one corner, still rusted from disuse. Or maybe not unused, just wiped clean afterward. George didn't say much as he worked. His face was locked in a grim, unreadable mask, but Thomas watched his hands. The way they trembled when he passed by the chains. The way he avoided eye contact. "Do you believe in what he's doing?" Thomas finally asked. George didn't look at him. "Does it matter?" he said. Thomas stepped closer. "It matters to me." George stopped, leaning his broom against the wall. "I believed once," he said. "I thought pain was part of salvation, that obedience would lead to purity. I watched him do things I can't explain. I watched women forgive him for it. I told myself that meant it was holy. But now?" George looked at the floor. "Now I just want to survive." Thomas lowered his voice. "Would you help stop him?" A long pause. Then softly, "If you have a plan, I'll listen." By nightfall, the house had gone quiet again. Everyone knew what tomorrow meant. Lydia sat with Ruth on her lap, brushing her hair with trembling hands. Ruth didn't understand why everyone was so tense. She thought tomorrow was another ceremony, like the ones they had every week. Just longer, maybe more prayers. She liked the candles. She didn't like the silence. "Will there be singing?" she asked. Lydia didn't answer. She just kissed her head and kept brushing. Across the room, Agnes stood at the hearth, feeding small logs into the fire. Margaret walked in, holding a cloth bundle. Without speaking, she tossed it into the flames. Robe caught quickly. None of them said a word. That night, Margaret crept into the chapel again, this time with Thomas and George behind her. They carried lanterns, their boots echoing faintly against the stone floor. They didn't need to speak. They knew what they were here to do. Margaret approached the altar and opened the hidden compartment beneath it, a narrow drawer carved into the wood. Inside, Richard kept the sacramental oil, dried herbs, and a vial of something darker. She dumped them all into a sack. Thomas began scraping the floor with a knife, digging at the painted sigils embedded in the wood. George poured vinegar across the symbols. It smelled like burning skin. "We can't stop the ritual from being called," Margaret said, "but we can ruin the tools." Thomas nodded. "He'll be furious." George lifted a torch. "Let him be. He needs darkness to do what he does. Let's give him light instead." He pressed the torch to the edge of the altar cloth. It caught. The fire spread quickly, licking the base of the wood, climbing upward. Smoke billowed toward the ceiling, and the old stones seemed to sigh from the sudden heat. They didn't stay long. Just long enough to be sure it wouldn't die out. As they stepped outside, the wind struck their faces like a warning, but none of them turned back. At dawn, Richard stood outside the chapel, watching the smoke curl into the sky. His robes flapped around him like the wings of a great black bird. The fire had been controlled enough to preserve the structure, but the altar was gone burnt to a crisp. The sigils scorched away. The sacred oil melted into the floor. He didn't yell. He didn't rage. He just stood in the snow, staring. Behind him, the family gathered in silence. Margaret stood beside Thomas, her coat pulled tight, her jaw set. Agnes stood with the children. Lydia held Ruth's hand. Richard turned slowly. "We will begin the ritual tonight," he said calmly. The fire was not a warning. It was a trial, and we passed it. He smiled. It was the smile of a man who believed that nothing could stop him now. Margaret's hand clenched at her side. Tonight, she thought, something ends. The compound had never been so quiet. It was a silence that stretched like skin pulled too tight. Even the wind outside seemed to hold its breath. No prayers echoed from the chapel. No chants from the living quarters. Just the creak of old wood, and the occasional cough from a child, too afraid to sleep. Inside the main house, the air felt heavier than usual. The hearth fire glowed faintly in the corner, casting long shadows that flickered across the floor like reaching fingers. The children were already dressed in their white garments, sitting stiffly in a row near the dining room. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide, unmoving. Not a single one of them spoke. Margaret paced slowly near the back wall, her arms crossed. Watching everything. She could feel it. Richard was preparing, not just for ceremony, but for domination. He'd twisted the fire into a symbol of his strength, not his weakness. He stood taller now, more confident, as if the flames had proven he'd been chosen. The ritual wasn't delayed. It was transformed. Thomas stood at the window, scanning the woods for any sign of help that wasn't coming. No one was coming. No one ever did. Agnes moved around the kitchen like a ghost. She didn't speak, didn't cry, but Margaret saw her. Palm a thin line of blood across the center, self-inflicted, a sign of repentance. Agnes had started punishing herself again, slipping quietly back into submission now that the ritual was near. Margaret reached out and gently took her hand. "You don't have to do this," she whispered. Agnes didn't answer, but she didn't pull away either. Lydia entered, holding a robe in her arms. Ruth's. She didn't say a word, just placed it on the table and stepped back. Her eyes were blank, hollow, like she was already gone. The robe sat there in silence. White as bone. By sundown, the family moved in procession toward the chapel. No torches, no songs, only footsteps, crunching softly in the snow. Richard led them, dressed in black robes this time, not white. The change unsettled Margaret. It meant something symbolic, but she didn't yet know what. His beard had been trimmed, his hair slicked back, and he walked as though a crown were already resting on his head. Behind him walked the children, followed by Agnes, Lydia, and the rest of the adult followers. George moved stiffly, his hands twitching in his coat pockets. Margaret and Thomas brought up the rear, sharing one last glance before entering. The chapel had been partially cleaned after the fire. The altar was gone burned to ash, but Richard had replaced it with a simple stone table, a temporary offering. He claimed, until the angel revealed the new design, the sigils were gone. But new ones had been drawn, not fresh ones. Margaret noticed something else, too. The iron hooks on the eastern wall, the ones used to hold ceremonial cloth, had been replaced with leather straps, straps large enough to hold a person. Richard stood at the front and raised his arms. Tonight, the sacred unification begins. Anew, he said, voice clear and calm. We have been tested by fire, and the angel has found us faithful. He gestured to Thomas. My son, bring forth the book. Thomas stepped forward, carrying the red journal. But he didn't open it. He simply placed it on the stone table, then stepped back without a word. Richard's eyes flickered toward him for a moment, then returned to the others. The first vessel shall be brought forward. Margaret's blood turned cold. She stepped in front of Mary before Richard could raise his hand. Not her, she said. Richard's eyes narrowed. Margaret, no. He took a step closer. Step aside, child. The ritual must begin. She looked past him to the faces in the room, to Lydia, who trembled but said nothing, to Agnes, who gripped Ruth's hand so tightly it looked painful, to George, who avoided her eyes. Look at them, she said. You say we're chosen, but we're terrified. We're hollow. You've drained us. You speak from weakness, Richard said, raising his voice. But I speak for the divine. No, she snapped. You speak for yourself. Richard moved toward her, fast. But this time, Margaret didn't back down. She stepped in front of Mary and held her ground. Then Thomas stepped forward too. She's not alone, he said. We won't let you take her. Richard turned on him. You would betray your own father? I'd rather betray you than become you. A ripple moved through the room. Quiet at first, then George stepped forward. She's right, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. This isn't salvation. It's sickness. Richard froze. One by one, others began shifting, moving away from the children, away from him, Maureen, Lydia, even Agnes. He looked around, suddenly realizing he was no longer at the center. I have spoken with angels, he said, his voice rising. I have walked through fire. You will not defy the will of heaven. No, Margaret said, taking Mary's hand. You walked through fire and still came out a monster. Richard's face changed then. The certainty vanished. Something cracked. He reached for the journal, as if it could shield him. Thomas stepped forward and slammed it shut. You won't hurt anyone else, he said. Richard looked at him, and for the first time, there was fear in his eyes. Real fear. They left the chapel that night as a group. No one spoke. The snow fell lightly as they walked back to the house. Richard didn't follow. He stayed in the chapel, staring at the closed book, as if expecting the angel to intervene. But no voice came. No light shone. Just silence. Inside the house, the children were put to bed. Mary lay down beside Ruth and finally fell asleep. Agnes sat near the fire and wept, not loudly, not in grief, but quietly, like someone who had been holding their breath for too many years. Lydia held Thomas's hand and said, Thank you. And Margaret sat at the window, watching the chapel across the snow-covered yard, waiting for any sign that Richard was coming. But he never did. He stayed inside, alone. His reign had ended, but the wounds remained. Morning came with golden light for the first time in weeks. The snowfall had slowed, and sun rays slipped through the bare trees like soft fingers reaching out from heaven. It should have been a sign of peace. But inside the Murphy compound, no. One celebrated the light. Peace hadn't arrived. Only a pause. Margaret stood at the kitchen sink, scrubbing the same tin plate over and over until her hands went numb. Across the room, Agnes swept the floor, slower than usual. Her face was gaunt, but calm, not joyful, just hollowed out. The way a storm hollows a field, but leaves it standing. Mary and Ruth sat by the fire, their hands buried in a bucket of buttons and scraps of yarn. They played silently. Margaret watched them with guarded eyes. Children had the strange ability to recover faster than adults, but she knew better than to assume healing was the same as forgetting. Thomas sat at the table, flipping through the red journal, the one that used to hold Richard's visions. But now it was something else, an artifact of delusion, a record of sickness dressed as scripture. He's still in the chapel, Thomas said quietly. Margaret didn't look up. He hasn't eaten, he continued. Agnes left a plate outside last night. Still there this morning. Margaret dropped the plate she'd been scrubbing. It clattered into the sink. Then let him starve? She said. Thomas met her eyes. You don't think he's done? She shook her head. Monsters don't disappear just because no one's listening anymore. By midday, the tension began to return. Not loudly, not with threats or sermons, but subtly. The younger men, those who had once followed Richard without question, began whispering again. George overheard them in the woodshed, speaking about the broken chain and God's silence as punishment. Some of them hadn't liked the interruption of the ritual. They hadn't said it out loud the night before, but now, in the absence of Richard's control, they were trying to fill the vacuum with confusion and fear. Maureen approached Margaret. Near the pantry door. They're scared, she said, glancing back toward the barn. And scared men look for someone to blame. Margaret nodded. Let them look. But she knew what Maureen really meant. If fear spread, if confusion turned into chaos, Richard wouldn't have to return to power. His ideas would do it for him. People had already absorbed his poison for too long. Some didn't know how to function without it. Later that day, Margaret sat with Thomas in the attic. They unrolled old blueprints of the compound drawn years ago by Richard's own hand. The original plans included escape tunnels that were never built. But the schematics gave Margaret an idea. We can lead them. Out, she said. Not all of them, but the ones who want to leave. Before something worse happens. Thomas traced the lines on the page. We'd need a wagon, supplies, and someone to stall the others. Margaret pointed at a small rectangle on the map. The woodshed. We can store everything here, quietly, one bag at a time. Thomas looked at her, surprised. You've been thinking about this a long time, haven't you? She nodded. Since before I found the cell in the basement. He folded the map. Then we start tonight. Richard remained locked inside the chapel. He hadn't spoken since the night of the failed ritual. But inside that silent, scorched room, he was not idle. He sat in the dark, surrounded by torn journal pages and broken candle stubs, scribbling with frantic hands. His eyes were bloodshot. His nails cracked and blackened from gripping the cold stone floor. He hadn't bathed, hadn't eaten, but his mind was racing. He believed the angel had abandoned him, but abandonment wasn't rejection. It was a test. He was being punished because his flock had failed him. Margaret, Thomas, even Agnes. They had allowed weakness to enter the house. They had desecrated the altar. And now he was alone. Yes, but not defeated. He still had the prophecy. He still had his name. And he still had the bloodline. He reached for a blank page and began writing. The unification has not been denied, only delayed. The vessel remains, the child remains. The light must still be born. He smiled through cracked lips. The cleansing will resume. Soon. Down in the woodshed, Margaret opened a hidden panel behind. A row of planks. It led to a shallow pit, once used for root vegetables. Now it would hold their escape packs, blankets, bread, a small jar of honey, matches, and the compass. Agnes arrived with Ruth, holding her gently by the shoulders. "Are you sure?" she asked. "No," Margaret replied, "but I'd rather die running than watch her be chosen next." Agnes nodded. "I'll bring Mary after dark." George entered a moment later, carrying a canvas sack. "No one saw me," he said. "But you should hurry. I think they're watching again." "Who?" Thomas asked. George hesitated. "Elias and two of the others. The ones who never believed in stopping the ritual. They think Richard was right." Margaret's heart tightened. "He's got roots in their heads," George added. "They're afraid of silence more than they're afraid of him." Margaret clenched her jaw. "Then we leave tomorrow." That night, the house was still, but not asleep. Lydia sat near the door, cradling Ruth and humming. Agnes packed quietly. Thomas made one final pass of the house perimeter, and returned and barred the windows. Everything was ready. Just past midnight, Margaret moved from room to room, gently waking those who would come. Mary, Ruth, Agnes, George, and Maureen. A few others young. Ones, uncertain but desperate. They crept outside, bundled in cloaks, holding one another by the hand. The snow was light, the moon high. No one spoke, not until they reached the woodshed. Then someone whispered, "Where's Thomas?" Margaret turned. Sharply. He'd been behind her seconds ago, but now, gone. She scanned the shadows. "Nothing. Stay here," she said. "Don't move." She retraced her steps, slipping behind the barn. The air was sharp. Her boots crunched softly on the icy path. Then she heard it. A muffled cry. From the direction of the chapel, her blood froze. She moved faster, her heart pounding against her ribs like a warning drum. The chapel door was ajar. Smoke curled from within. And just inside, she saw them. Thomas. And Richard. The chapel was colder than the night air outside. The scent of smoke lingered in the rafters, not from fire, but from the burning of oil and incense. Candles lined the stone table, their flames still dancing in shallow bowls of ash. And at the far end, under that soft, flickering glow, stood Richard Murphy. One hand gripped Thomas's collar. The other held a small blade carved from bone. Thomas's face was pale, streaked with blood from a cut above his brow. His feet dragged on the floor, and though he was taller than Richard now, he looked small like a boy again. "Let him go," Margaret said, stepping fully into the chapel. Richard didn't flinch. "You brought this darkness upon us," he said, voice calm, almost gentle. "You, with your defiance, your disobedience, your rebellion." Margaret's eyes didn't leave Thomas. "He's not your son." "Not anymore." Richard tilted his head, smiling faintly. "He never was mine. He was theirs, the angels. I was only the vessel." She took a step forward. "Then why are you afraid of him?" Richard's smile wavered. "You're still trying to understand this with logic, with reason, but faith. Faith doesn't require your understanding, Margaret. It only demands your surrender." "I surrendered once," she said, "and I watched what you did to Mary. I listened to Ruth cry herself to sleep. I saw Agnes break piece by piece while you called it worship." He pressed the blade closer to Thomas's neck. "Careful, now." Margaret's voice dropped low. "If you kill him, even your loyal ones will turn on you. They already have doubts. You're losing them." Richard's jaw twitched. "They're sheep," he spat. "They need a shepherd. They need freedom." He stepped back from Thomas, just slightly, then lifted the knife into the candlelight. "I was given a vision," he whispered. "The angels spoke again last night. This world will fall. This place will rise, but only if the bloodline is preserved." Margaret's chest tightened. "Mary?" she asked. "She is the vessel," he said, eyes distant. "Her womb, untouched by the corrupted world. She will bring forth the new light. And Thomas, my loyal flame. He is the other half. Thomas's voice cracked. You're insane. Richard backhanded him. Margaret lunged forward, but stopped. When he turned, blade gleaming. She is not your daughter, she said quietly. She is not your bride. She is a child. Richard lowered the blade to his side. That's why she's pure. That's why heaven chose her. Margaret stepped closer. She's not chosen. She's trapped. The candle flames flared slightly, just enough to throw a flicker of doubt into Richard's eyes. He blinked. Just once, and in that breath, Thomas broke free. He shoved his elbow back into Richard's ribs, spinning out of his grip. The knife clattered to the floor. Margaret rushed forward. Richard scrambled, grabbing for the blade, but Margaret reached it first and kicked it across the room. She grabbed Thomas's arm, pulling him toward the door, but Richard didn't chase. He just stood there, staring. You're all dead, he murmured. You don't even know it yet. Margaret didn't look back. She and Thomas fled into the night. Back at the woodshed, the others were already preparing to leave. George had harnessed the wagon. Agnes had wrapped Ruth in layers of wool. Mary clutched Lydia's hand so tightly it turned purple. When Margaret and Thomas arrived, breathless and red-faced, they didn't explain. There was no time. We go now, Margaret said. But it's still dark, Maureen whispered. We don't have until morning. The group moved fast. Bags were thrown into the wagon. Children lifted up. Blankets layered. Agnes carried a lantern under her cloak, shielding the flame from the wind. No one said goodbye. They didn't look back. The path to the north was narrow-lined with pine trees and rocks glazed in ice. The wagon creaked softly, wheels struggling against the hardened snow. But they kept moving, step by step, hour by hour, toward the mountains, toward freedom. Behind them, Richard stood at the window of the chapel, watching the woods. He saw nothing, but he knew. He could feel them leaving. Like threads snapping loose from a tapestry, he had spent 2 decades weaving. His empire crumbling. His voice no longer feared. The angel had gone silent. He walked slowly back to the table, sat down, and opened the red journal. His hand trembled slightly as he dipped the quill into ink. The betrayers flee, but the fire follows them. They believe. They escape judgment, but judgment travels without sound. One by one, the blood will call them back. He set the quill down. Then he closed his eyes and waited for a voice that didn't come. The forest thickened as morning approached. The wagon rolled slowly, creaking over roots and rocks. The children were asleep under layers of blankets, but the adults remained alert, each turn of the path another potential danger. Margaret sat at the front beside George, her hand gripping the lantern tightly. Do you think he'll come after us? George asked. No, she said. He won't need to. George glanced sideways. What do you mean? He planted fear in their bones for years. That doesn't disappear overnight. It follows you. George nodded. But we're not turning back, she added. No matter what we feel. We keep going. Behind them, Agnes leaned over to Mary and whispered, Are you warm? Mary nodded. Is it over? The girl asked. Agnes looked toward the rising sun. Not yet, she said. But we're getting there. By the time the wagon crested the final ridge, the sun had fully risen. Below them, the first glimpse of the valley appeared: open land, scattered farms, smoke rising from a distant chimney. Civilization. A place with a name Murphy meant nothing. Margaret felt something break inside her. Not pain, not joy, just release. She climbed down and helped the others out. The snow here was softer, the air different. I don't know where this road leads, she said, but I know it doesn't lead back. One by one, they nodded. Agnes holding Ruth's hand, Lydia still silent, but stronger. George and Maureen. Thomas beside her, quiet, watching the sky. Mary stepped forward. Can we live here? Margaret knelt in front of her. Not yet, she said, but we can begin. Mary looked at the valley again. Can we choose our own names? Margaret smiled, tears in her eyes. Yes, she whispered. You can be whoever you want. The valley felt like a second world. Soft hills, untrodden snow, and the absence of his voice. For the first time in years, there were no sermons at dawn, no bells, no blood-soaked scripture. Just silence, the kind that felt like mercy. They settled in a small cabin near the southern edge of a village called Copper Hollow. The owner had long since passed, and the structure had been empty for years. George and Thomas repaired the broken windows. Agnes stitched curtains from old blankets. Lydia patched the roof with tar paper and prayer. They didn't speak much about the compound. Not at first. They were too busy surviving. They hunted squirrels, boiled snow for water, and ate bread so stale it cut the roof of their mouths. But the pain didn't matter. The cold didn't matter. They were free. And for a moment, that felt like enough. But freedom doesn't always erase the scars that control leaves behind. Margaret knew this. She saw it in the children, how Mary still flinched when a man raised his voice, even if it was just to call for firewood. How Ruth covered her ears during thunderstorms. How Lydia slept by the door with a kitchen knife beneath her pillow. Trauma had followed them, slipped into their bags like extra blankets. And Richard was still alive. She thought about him every night, not out of fear, but out of calculation. The man didn't surrender. He adapted. And if the silence from him was stretching this long, it meant he was planning something. She knew it in her bones. 3 weeks after they arrived in Copper Hollow, a stranger knocked on the cabin door. Thomas answered. The man was tall, in his mid-40s, with a narrow jaw and a thick coat covered in snow. He held a bundle under one arm, paper, tied in string. You're the family that came down from the North Woods, he said, not asking. Thomas didn't reply. The man smiled faintly and held out the bundle. I'm from the paper in Fairbridge. 20 miles east. We heard rumors. Children in robes, fires, a compound. Thomas took the bundle, but didn't invite him in. You're welcome to read it, the man said. But if you don't want anyone to know what happened, that's your choice. He turned and walked away without another word. Inside the bundle were newspapers. Headlines. Double quotes. Women escape Northern cult. Children of the angel. Claim abuse. Authorities investigating abandoned religious compound. There were sketches. 2. Of Richard. Of the chapel. Of children. Margaret stared at the pages for a long time. Then she folded them up and placed them under the stove. Agnes asked her quietly, shouldn't we tell them the truth? Margaret shook her head. They wouldn't believe the truth, Lydia added. And if they did, they'd try to fix us. She was right. This kind of pain, this kind of violation, wasn't something you could explain to a judge or a journalist. It lived in the quiet spaces between words. Later that night, Thomas found Margaret sitting alone near the edge of the woods. He sat beside her, offering a cup of lukewarm tea. Do you think we'll ever forget? He asked. No, she said, but I think we'll remember less violently. He looked up at the moon. I used to dream of running away when I was little, but even in my dreams, I couldn't leave the gate. Margaret didn't respond. The gate was always closed in dreams. That was how the compound worked. Even when you left it, part of it stayed. In you. Thomas leaned forward. He'll come for us. Margaret looked at him. I know. They sat in silence, 2 siblings born in blood, waiting for a ghost that still breathed. A week later, It happened. Agnes came running up from the village. Breathless and pale, they found someone. Margaret dropped her basket. Where? At the old orchard, behind the mill. She didn't need to ask who. She already knew. By the time they reached the orchard, a small crowd had gathered. The sheriff stood at the edge of the trees, hat in hand, pointing toward a patch of turned soil. Beneath it lay a man, thin, barefoot, draped in a rotting robe. He was unconscious, but breathing. His hands were scarred. His mouth was stained with soot. And on his chest, carved crudely with a blade, was the word prophet. Margaret didn't say a word. Thomas stepped forward. It's him. The sheriff turned. You know him? He kept us in a cage for most of our lives, Thomas said. The sheriff frowned. He's half dead. Thomas nodded. He'll recover. The sheriff hesitated. We'll hold him in Fairbridge jail until he's stable. If you want to press charges, you'll need to testify. Margaret stepped forward. No, she said. We're not testifying. The sheriff blinked. Ma'am? He ran an illegal cult. There are children involved. If he walks free. He won't walk free, Margaret said. He'll never be free again. The sheriff didn't understand. But he nodded. The man in the soil stirred. Just once. Then fell still again. Back at the cabin, Agnes cooked stew while the children played with sticks in the snow. Mary built a little house of pine cones and rocks. Ruth gave it a name. Hope House, she said. George laughed softly. Thomas sat with the journal in his lap, writing. Every detail, every name, every page of horror documented in case someone needed to know. Someday. Lydia read it every night. Not to relive it, but to reclaim it. To turn the nightmare into something she owned. Not something that owned her. Margaret added her own entries too. Not just facts, but feelings. And at the back of the journal, she wrote something she never thought she'd say out loud. I am no longer afraid of him. I am afraid of forgetting what made me strong. That night, Thomas found her staring at the hills again. You okay? He asked. I don't want revenge, she said. I thought I did, but I don't. What do you want? To build something that he can't tear down, not ever. Thomas placed his hand over hers. Then we will. The wind moved softly through the trees. No screams, no songs, just wind. The snow returned the next morning, covering Copper Hollow in a blanket of stillness. It came down heavy, quiet, thick flakes that muted footsteps and softened the edges of things. But Margaret's thoughts remained sharp. She stood near the woodpile, axe in hand, splitting logs with clean, practiced swings. Her hands had calluses now. Her arms had strength. And yet, inside her chest, something wouldn't settle. Thomas joined her not long after, handing her a tin mug of tea. He looked older than he had weeks ago, not physically, but in presence. There was something settled behind his eyes now. Something steady. He's awake, Thomas said. Margaret paused mid-swing. In Fairbridge, he continued. Sheriff says he's talking again. Not much, just bits. She didn't ask what he was saying. She already knew. Thomas hesitated. They want us to come identify him officially, for the record. Margaret placed the axe against the chopping block. Do they think we might forget his face? Thomas gave a weak smile. I told them there's no chance of that. They stood in silence for a while, watching the snow pile up. We should go, she said finally. Not for him. For U.S. The ride to Fairbridge was long and cold. The trail wound through pine forests and across a half-frozen stream. George drove the wagon, while Margaret and Thomas sat in the back, wrapped in wool blankets. Agnes had stayed behind to watch the children. Lydia had offered to come, but Margaret told her no. This wasn't something she needed anyone else to carry. At the jailhouse, a deputy led them through a narrow corridor lined with rusted bars. The smell of mildew and old sweat hung thick in the air. At the end of the hallway was a small cell, and inside, sitting cross-legged on the floor, was Richard Murphy. He was thinner now, hair longer, eyes duller. But even in this diminished state, Margaret could still see it, the quiet arrogance, the smirk that never fully disappeared, the belief that he was still chosen. He looked up when they approached. "Ah," he said softly, "the fire returns." Neither Margaret nor Thomas replied. "I knew you'd come," Richard said, pulling his robe tighter around him. It was no longer ceremonial, just a faded piece of cloth, his badge of madness. "You look disappointed," Thomas said. "I'm not," Richard replied. "I'm fulfilled." Margaret stepped closer to the bars. "You failed," she said. "You'll die here." Richard smiled faintly. "The vessel still lives." Margaret's voice didn't waver. "And she will grow up without fear, without chains, without your name." "That's not how prophecy works," he murmured. She stared at him, breathing deeply. "You don't have power anymore," she said. "You don't have a flock. You're a man behind bars, waiting for time to forget you." Richard's fingers twitched. "I planted seeds," he whispered. "And seeds don't die in winter. They sleep. But they wake." Margaret turned away. "We're not afraid of you anymore." On the way back to the cabin, the snow began to lighten. They said nothing for a long time. Thomas stared out across the trees. "Do you think he's right? That his ideas will survive?" Margaret's breath fogged in the cold. "I think poison can survive a long time if it hides in people." He nodded. "But I also think truth burns it out," she added, "even if it takes generations." They passed the same half-frozen stream, same winding trees. But something felt different, less like an escape, more like a return. That evening, Margaret stood near the fire, reading through the final pages of the red journal. She'd written on every one her handwriting now filled the spaces between Richard's original verses. His madness was still there, but so was her clarity. She placed the book on the hearth. Thomas came in quietly behind her. "You sure you want to do this?" he asked. She nodded. He handed her a match. She struck it, watching the flame bloom. Then gently, she set the journal into the fire. The pages curled inward, blackening, releasing decades of darkness into smoke and ember. It didn't scream. It didn't resist. It simply ended. Agnes watched from the corner, one hand over her heart. Ruth leaned against Lydia's leg, and Mary asked softly, "Is it gone?" Margaret bent down, brushing hair from her forehead. "Not yet," she said, "but we're close." They buried the ashes in the woods behind the cabin. All of them went, children included. Margaret didn't want this to be a secret. Secrets had built the last life. Truth would build the next. She placed the small tin box into the soil and covered it with snow and dirt. No prayers. No chants. Only words spoken by choice. "This is the end," she said. "Not of this story, but of his part in it." They stood in silence for a moment, then turned and walked back together. Days passed. Then weeks. The nightmares didn't vanish, but they changed. Mary still woke sometimes in the dark, clutching her blanket. But now, she whispered Ennis's name, not Richard's. And when Margaret held her, the tremors calmed. Ruth began humming again. George built a sled. Thomas carved wooden animals for the children. And Lydia started singing, softly at first, but soon. The cabin was filled with her voice each morning. Hymns she made up on the spot. Songs about mountains and fire and rain. Margaret kept writing. Not just in journals, but in the dirt with a stick. On scraps of bark. She wrote down everything. She remembered not to keep it alive, but to drag it into the open where it couldn't hide. And when she ran out of things to say about Richard Murphy, she began writing about herself. what it meant to survive, to feel again, to love again. Spring came early that year. The snow melted faster than usual, revealing moss and crocus shoots. Beneath the trees, squirrels returned. Birds filled the mornings with chatter. And one afternoon, Ruth came running into the cabin, breathless. "There's a visitor," she shouted. They stepped outside to find a woman approaching the cabin holder, wrapped in a long green coat, face lined by time. She introduced herself as Helen, said she ran a home for orphans and survivors out east. She'd read about the escapees from the Murphy compound in the newspaper and had followed the trail. "I don't mean to intrude," she said, "but if you ever want to tell your story to the world, to other girls, to those still trapped, I can help." Margaret looked at the others. Agnes, Thomas, Lydia. Then she looked at Mary. The girl took her hand, and for the first time in her life, nodded before being asked. Margaret smiled. "We'll think about it," she said, "but we're not hiding anymore." Helen left a card and promised to return. And that night, Margaret opened a fresh page in her new journal and wrote, "Let them know what he did. Let them see what we became in spite of it." Spring gave way to warmth, and with it came a gentler kind of silence, the kind that didn't suffocate. Birds sang from the branches of new trees. The children ran through tall grass without fear of being called back, and the air, once heavy with control, was now full of possibility. In the valley, the Murphy name was barely whispered anymore. The jail in Fairbridge still held Richard Murphy. He hadn't spoken to anyone in weeks. Not the guards, not the priests, not the doctor who visited twice a month to examine his decaying body. He had withered, not just in flesh, but in presence. There were no followers coming to visit, no letters, no second generation to carry the madness forward. Whatever legacy he believed he was building had died long before his bones ever would. And yet, he lingered, sitting on that hard cot, muttering into the walls, waiting, always waiting, for a voice that no longer came. Back at the cabin, the family had begun to grow in ways that had nothing to do with blood. A few more children arrived rescued. From other places, not all from cults, but all with wounds invisible to the world. Helen brought them slowly, one at a time, never forcing, only offering. Agnes became the soft voice at bedtime. George taught the older ones how to carve spoons and fish from the river. Thomas handled the heavy lifting, chopping wood, fixing the roof, holding space when no one else could. Lydia took over the journal keeping, collecting small poems and stories from each child, preserving them not as a record of trauma but as proof of who they were becoming. And Margaret became the anchor. She didn't plan it, didn't try to lead, but they followed her anyway, because she had once burned under a man's belief and survived, because her voice didn't tremble when she spoke, because she listened before she judged. She never claimed sainthood, only responsibility. And that, somehow, was enough. One afternoon in late June, a letter arrived. The handwriting was unfamiliar, clean, precise. The return address was a courthouse, Fairbridge. Thomas read it first, and folded it carefully, and handed it to Margaret. She read in silence. The state was dropping the case. No formal trial, no testimony. The jail term would be extended indefinitely due to Richard's unstable mental condition. He was considered non-violent, though incapable of rehabilitation. He would die there, alone, under quiet watch. It wasn't justice in the way some imagined, but for Margaret, it was closure. And it came without the need to bleed again in public. She placed the letter in a small wooden box beside a handful of river stones Mary had once collected. No fanfare. Just another day moving forward. That summer, the garden bloomed like never before. Bright green herbs along the fence line, tomatoes so red They glowed in the sun. Squash, beans, corn, everything grown by hand, with love instead of fear. Ruth chased chickens across the yard, laughing, until she collapsed in the grass. Mary wrote her own name in chalk on the cabin wall, then wrote a new name beside it. Eva, because I get to choose now, she said. And Margaret knelt beside her, touching the chalk. Yes, she whispered. You do. It was Lydia who suggested it first. We should write it all down, she said. Not just in our journals, not hidden, out loud, like a book. Agnes hesitated. What if people don't believe us? Margaret answered softly. Then we tell it anyway. They agreed to do it together. Over weeks, then months. In the evenings, after dinner. By lantern light, while the children slept. They wrote everything. The rituals, the isolation, the lies masked as scripture. The bodies. The silence, and then the escape. The survival. The rebuilding. The truth. Every chapter ended with a voice, not Richard's, not the angels, but theirs. One by one, they claimed the story, and when it was finished, they wrapped it in cloth, tied it with twine, and sent it to Helen, who promised to find a publisher. It wasn't about fame. It wasn't about revenge. It was about putting a name to the thing they'd endured, because silence had been their prison. But voice was the door out. In the fall, a visitor arrived. Not Helen, not a sheriff. Just a woman, traveling alone, maybe 30 years old. She had the same tired eyes Margaret had seen in herself once long ago, when she first started realizing her life was not what it should have been. The woman stepped into the cabin quietly, clutching a copy of the book. I found you, she said. I didn't know if I ever would. Margaret offered her tea. Agnes held her hand. Lydia brought her a blanket. She cried for a long time, and then she said something none of them would forget. I thought it was only me. They all nodded. Because that was the first lie every abuser told. You're alone. But now the truth was walking, breathing, sitting right across from her. You're not. On the last day of October, they held a bonfire behind the cabin, not to burn books. Not to cast out devils, just to feel warmth together. The children danced in circles. Ruth told a scary story about a bear with one eye. George sang an old hymn stripped of its shame and turned into a lullaby, and Margaret stood at the edge, watching them all, her arms crossed, her eyes shining. Thomas stepped beside her. You ever think we'd get here? He asked. Margaret shook her head. Not once, but here we are. She smiled, finally. And nodded. Double quotes. Yes, here we are. The wind rustled through the trees. No chanting. No screams. Just laughter, sparks, and the sound of new beginnings.